It might not have been the draft class that every Chicago Bears fan wanted, but the team did get better this weekend and added quality players at positions of need.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook and join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. On the show today, we break down this Bears draft class. A whole lot of wheeling and dealing on day 3. Some impact players brought in on day 2, but still kind of leaving this feeling of like still not getting as many players around Justin Fields as possible. But we'll kind of talk about how you draw the line here of evaluating the draft class versus evaluating the state of the roster. We'll kind of look also at, okay, if not the guys they had taken in that second round, let's look at who was available at each spot and what some of the potential alternatives were and try and get into maybe some of Ryan Pohl's thought process there. And then we'll kind of wrap up with a look at some of the day 3 guys and where the impacts could be with 4 offensive linemen and some guys that are really intriguing if nothing else. But I want to start with this draft class as a whole and sort of the bigger picture, I guess, to some extent with the first few picks, right? There's that sour taste for a lot of Bears fans and people on Twitter that say, the Bears still didn't do a lot and enough to build around Justin Fields, right? They're using those 2 second-round picks on defense and not on wide receiver and offensive line and other things that are more closely tied to the quarterback. And that's a fair criticism of this Bears roster, no doubt. It's still a relatively weak wide receiving core and a relatively weak offensive line that both added draft picks, we should mention, but just not those quite full impact guys that you were maybe looking for or hoping for with those second round picks. But I think separately from that, this still looks like and is a good draft class by all means from what the Bears did. When you look at it a little bit more in a vacuum, if you're just evaluating the draft class, there's a lot to like. There's a lot of really quality players at positions of need. You got your starting safety, you got your starting cornerback, you added a slot receiver who maybe can do some outside stuff, is good with the ball in his hands after the catch. You added some great depth on the offensive line. There's an intriguing pass rusher. You got a punter in at the end there too, and now of course undrafted free agency, adding quite a few more players in this mix as well. But otherwise, it's a pretty good draft class. This is they got the cornerback Kyler Gordon was projected to either go around that range or even potentially a little bit earlier, borderline first round corner who's going to step in and be that starter opposite Jalen Johnson and give you your sort of bookend outside cornerbacks for the foreseeable future. And there's a lot to like about the physical tools that Kyler Gordon brings, ball skills. Maybe he needs a little bit of coaching up and rough around the edges in that regard, but that's sort of the theme of the types of players the Bears pursued this season. But of course, a massive need at cornerback. And it's you can criticize them all you want, and very legitimately, for not having put enough around Justin Fields. But had they used the first two second-round picks on a wide receiver and offensive lineman, for example, and you had this big hole at cornerback with just another late-round day 3 type player plugged in there, there'd be criticism there. It's this secondary would be terrible if you didn't have Kyler Gordon and Jaquan Brisker in there in those spots. You could very strongly make the argument that yes, I would rather have better around Fields and have bigger question marks in the secondary than I would, better secondary and bigger question marks around Justin Fields in terms of importance to this team. That's fine, but I think you can say I think these two things can be true at the same time. That Bears got some really good players and good value at good spots at positions of need. And this is like, on paper, after draft day, a draft class that you can feel good about in terms of the quality and frequency and volume of talent that the Bears were able to acquire. And they still need to do more around Justin Fields and have not properly surrounded Justin Fields with talent. Like, I think these things can be true at the same time. And I think too often we're sort of like saying, well, who cares what the draft class is good because this. It's like, well, no, let's wait a minute. Let's make sure that we recognize too that like this is a draft class to be excited about, because Jaquan Brisker could be a great box safety to kind of come down with some versatility to cover on the back end. Again, moves pretty well. Still got a wide receiver in that third round, and then a bunch of offensive linemen late in the draft that, yes, 6th and 7th round picks, chances are relatively low for any of them individually to become stars in the NFL. But when you take 7 swings at the fence, or 8 day 3 picks and 6 picks in round 6 and 7, those are all lottery ticket type picks, right? Chances are low, but if one of them hits, it becomes a really, really great value. And the more shots you get at it, the more opportunities you have for one of them to potentially pan out. If you only had 3 of those, chances pretty low that one of those 3 happens to happen. When you have 8 of those, seems like maybe the odds are a little bit better that one of them, or maybe 2 of them, could become something better than you would typically expect from a 6th or 7th round pick. So I guess my point here is that, like, you don't have to be super pessimistic about this draft class just because it didn't fill the Justin Fields holes the way you might have wanted them to. But those are still valid concerns. But we can also be excited about the players that they did add and still also have concerns about the spots that they haven't properly filled, which, by the way, they do still have some free agent opportunities here. Ryan Poles even mentioned, 53-man roster cut down. They could potentially still add talent there, or trades during the preseason or during the season. There are still other ways to keep evaluating this team, and they're going to still sort of see this through. So to be determined on what this all looks like when it is fully together. But hey, there's still, I think, a lot to like about where things are going to go here. But I don't know, we can put on our amateur general manager hat and look at those 2 second-round picks and who was on the board and what the dynamics were, and we can say, okay, if we would have done it differently, how might we have done it differently? And how can we sort of look into what Ryan Poles' thought process might have been next on Locked On Bears. Just because the draft is behind us doesn't mean there aren't football bets you can place with our friends at betonline.net. They're going to be your number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information. You can bet on over-under for Bears win total this season. You can bet whether or not the Bears will make the playoffs this year. Plus, they got early odds on MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, a lot of NFL futures available. But it's really all the latest sports developments you need, league reviews and news, including the NBA playoffs going on right now, hockey season winding down, baseball season in the thick of it, and so much more. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, live betting, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. When the Bears were on the clock at 39, I think all of us had some kind of idea of who we would have wanted them to take with that first pick. And I don't know that Kyler Gordon was at the top of everybody's list, but he was certainly in that conversation and a good value there and a really good fit and all those different things. Like we talked about, there's a lot to like about Kyler Gordon. But, as those sort of picks were coming off, you get to 39 and a decent number of those wide receivers, for example, that we had sort of been eyeing and talking about and talking on and looking at how and when and where they might fit for the Bears, were still available at that spot, and they go cornerback. But okay, you've got the second round pick, 8 picks later, or do the math there for me, 9 picks later, and still 9 picks later, a couple of wide receivers come off the board in between. Wan'Dale Robinson goes to the Giants at 43. John Mechie goes to the Texans at 44. And then you get all the way to 48, and you still have George Pickens, Alec Pierce, and Sky Moore among the wide receivers still on the board at that spot, and the Bears opt to go safety there. But I can't help but look at the way it played out and the way teams seemed to view these wide receivers, and wonder if there wasn't more of a divide between maybe our view of these receivers and our desire for these receivers compared to NFL teams desires and views of these wide receivers. Because yes, like the Packers take Christian Watson at 34, right, at the top of the second round. They trade up for Christian Watson at 34 because clearly they saw him as the guy they felt like they had to have. And they just certainly didn't trust him to fall as far down as where they were picking him and felt like they had to jump all the way up there to go up and get him. But then from there, like when we talked about the Bears' options in the second round, and the ones we might be interested in at wide receiver, we talked about George Pickens, we talked about Sky Moore, and we talked a little bit about Alec Pierce, but not so much immediately in that like 39 quite type spot. And yet, there were 3 other wide receivers taken after Watson before Pickens, Pierce, and Moore went right after each other 3 in a row to the Steelers, Colts, and Chiefs at 52, 53, and 54. The Giants took Wan'Dale Robinson at 43, John Mechie at 44 to the Houston, and then the Patriots took Tyquan Thornton at 50. And it just strikes me there that like 3 teams took 3 different wide receivers that were all sort of outside of that group, that tier of receivers that we had in the Bears range. And so I just can't help but wonder, I just get the impression, right? It's not just like Ryan Poles specifically didn't value those receivers as highly, but other teams did, right? I mean, it's not that it was like that far down, but it was another, 7 picks or so after the Bears picked Brisker, right? After the Bears' second round pick. Yes, they could have traded down there and potentially still gotten one of those wide receivers. And honestly, I think that's kind of, if I could try and find the optimum outcome, I think among the 2 second-round picks, safety was the lesser need compared to cornerback. I like Brisker a lot, and I think he's a good pick, and I think it'll be a good fit next to Eddie Jackson and made the secondary a lot better. But like, I was warming up to the idea of like Cruikshank and DeAndre Houston Carson kind of competing with that. Plus, in free agency, you could still re-sign Gibson. He's still a free agent. There's still some other veterans out there that you could fill that safety need a little bit more easily there. And I would have, and of course, this is all hindsight 2020. Ryan Poles had no idea when these wide receivers would come off the board. And that's part of the other point here that we'll get to in a second. But like, if you could fully hindsight this, I don't mind staying at 39 and taking Gordon or, whatever you want to do there. But at 48, you could have traded down anywhere in the next 4 slots, or I guess you could have traded down from 39 too. I mean, either direction. Trade into that early 50s range, and I would have been happy landing any of Pickens, Pierce, or Moore in that spot, and then picking up, whatever day 3 pick you get for that move down, a 4th-round pick or maybe a 5th-round pick or something in there. And that was the bigger surprise for me in this draft, is that they didn't trade down from either of those 2nd-round spots or that 3rd-round spot. The trade downs didn't happen until day 3 of this draft. But I think for Ryan Poles, he was so much less focused on, okay, I have to get a wide receiver. Let me move around in the draft to where I'm still getting good value for that wide receiver or offensive line, right? He was not as worried about like position and more just said, let me get the best players for my football team, because this Bears team is not a wide receiver away. It's not an offensive lineman away. Like the Green Bay Packers felt like they're pretty close to a wide receiver away from being, to the Super Bowl or wherever their aspirations are going to be this season. I mean, yes, they're more than a wide receiver away, but no team is truly one player away, but that's sort of the feeling, right? It's like, oh, if they just add this, then they can overcome the rest. And the Packers felt like one of those teams that like, okay, we they missed out on all the receivers in the 1st round because there was a huge run of them in the top 20. And so they felt like, okay, early 2nd round, we need a wide receiver. This is like the missing piece or the biggest missing piece for our team that we feel like can put us over the top. And the Chicago Bears are not in that position. It's not to say that they don't have a big need there and that it wouldn't be very helpful and important to the team, but they're also in a spot where they had so many needs and so many spots where you just need to add the best young talent you possibly can to your roster. And so, they took the cornerback and the safety that they feel like are those big-time difference makers, players that they think can be difference makers and playmakers on that side of the ball. And Poles kind of hinted, we'll hear from Poles later this week, he kind of hinted that he didn't say anybody by name and didn't necessarily say the position by name, but he kind of hinted that like in the 2nd round at that spot, he kind of hinted that he didn't really see other guys at those other positions that can kind of make the type of impact that the cornerback and the safety can make. Sort of implying that maybe, he not that he didn't like the wide receivers, but didn't feel like they were as potentially special and dynamic as the defensive backs that they did take in that range. And so if as a general manager, you don't think Pickens and Pierce and Moore are quite that game-changing, and maybe they're a little bit lower on your board, then from there, how much of a gap is there between those three and Velus Jones, who they took in the third round, right? I mean, if you're dropping those three receivers that we kind of liked as outside evaluators, but if you're dropping them down a tier to maybe the other receivers we had a tier below, then that's much closer to like a Velus Jones anyway. So if you feel like you really like the cornerback and the safety here because they're great players in your mind, and these wide receivers are good, but aren't as separated from the pack as this cornerback and the safety, then I think that's where Ryan Poles' logic comes in there. And we've been using this in the context of wide receiver because that's sort of the big fantasy football position that everyone's more comfortable really evaluating. But the same is true for offensive line. I mean, there wasn't an offensive lineman drafted in the second round until 51. Cam Jurgens went to the Eagles. And then Luke Gadecki went 57, and then Ed Ingram went 59. But the offensive line class was not there in that early second round. So again, like maybe me personally, I kind of would have liked the idea of trading down and getting an offensive lineman and a wide receiver in that range. But if you're Ryan Poles and you say, you know what, this cornerback and safety are game changers, those offensive linemen are okay, those wide receivers are okay, and I could trade down and get two okay players, but I can stay here and get two guys that I feel like are going to be difference makers. That's what I think it ultimately comes down to, because then again, you start looking in the third round and you got Abraham Lucas at 72 right after the Bears took Velus Jones. Bernard Ryman from Central Michigan went 77, which was a huge drop for me. I was really surprised he went that low in this draft. And Dylan Parham went to the Rams at 90, and Sean Ryan went to the Packers at 92. I mean, like, there were wide receivers and offensive linemen more in that third round range where he felt like he could still get one there that's more in that tier of guys in his mind that we were looking at as potential second round guys that seem to be in that drop down. That's sort of my theory on how the Bears came to that and why they went to those positions and just didn't feel like the size of the need at wide receiver and offensive line didn't overtake his desire to just get the best players for his football team. They still got good football players in the third day of the draft in the 5th and 6th and 7th rounds. We'll kind of go through where some of the impact could come there and what we like and, what we can still kind of have questions about next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is powered by our friends at Built Bars, the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars, because I'm powered by Built Bars every single day. I eat one literally every day. I really have to limit myself to only one a day because they're so delicious. I could go through a box so fast because Built Bars don't taste like candy bars. Or don't taste like regular protein bars. They taste like candy bars. I'm getting ahead of myself here. They are just sweet, delicious, soft, easy to chew, covered in 100% real chocolate. But most importantly, they're good for you. They're low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. It's an unbeatable combination you can't find anywhere else, and you got to try it for yourself. Tasting is believing. Head on over to Built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15. You're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Whew. The Bears somehow went from a handful of day 3 picks to a bunch of day 3 picks. I think it went from 3 to 8 was how they turned it, because they started the draft with 6 picks and finished with 11. So the math there would add 5. Yeah, I think that adds up for me. And it, like we said at the top, like it's a great way to keep taking swings at the fences. But like specifically, you kind of like some of the different ways they dipped, and you really start to get a sense of the types of players and the draft strategy generally that Ryan Poles will take moving forward in terms of the types of talent and physical tools and those sorts of things. So you get Braxton Jones out of Southern Utah in the 5th round, potential compete to start at offensive tackle. I mean, long, moves well, strong, a little bit raw and a little bit more like top heavy in terms of the build there physically. But like, Larry Bourne was a 5th round pick last year. This is sort of this year's Larry Borum, not in terms of exactly the make and skill set, but just that type of role where fifth round rookie comes in, a lot to be encouraged about. Maybe he can compete with one of them and push them a little bit more. You go to Dominique Robinson later in the fifth round from Miami. He's a converted wide receiver who's playing pass rusher now. He's only been an edge rusher for like a couple of years, but like he moves like a wide receiver. He's big, right? I mean, he's bulked up and he's strong, but he's quick and bendy around the edge. And you like that he's got that type of speed and physical flexibility that you can't coach, and you can kind of coach the rest. And that's so much this Bears draft class across the board, and you can kind of see how this all comes together for polls. So many of these players have some kind of physical gifts. They all tend to be pretty athletic for their positions and do a lot of those things that you can't coach. And then they also really emphasize, they kept saying in the post-draft press conference, like the mentality, the people, their makeup, how they view football and competition. And so their strategy then that I think we will see continue in future drafts, regardless of position, is give me the guy that has some of the things we can't teach in terms of physical tools, and then the mentality that we evaluate psychologically or whatever to be great and be a good fit and be competitive and be a hardworking, type of human being that they want in their locker room, and take both of those things combined and then turn the coaches into developers and truly develop these players in the ways that can be coached, to get the guys that are lacking in the areas that can be coached and are exceeding in the areas that cannot be coached, and take the mentality with the tools, and our coaches will be the thing to unlock them. And I think it's sort of, I think there's some real stakes here, or there's some real like accountability here for the coaching staff, right? It's like, we are giving you these tools to build into something, build them into great football players. Not that like, if these 6th and 7th round picks never pan out, does that mean the coaches are bad? No, but you'd like to see some level of players at least getting better, right? You're not expecting all 4 offensive linemen they took in the 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds to become 4 starters, right? That's not a realistic, just not a realistic expectation for those guys. But you should, in theory, see most of them make some kind of progress. That doesn't mean they all make the 53-man roster. That doesn't mean none of them are on the practice squad. That doesn't mean none of them bust out. But like, let's see development if that's what you're drafting these players for. And in order to, and same with the edge rushers, same with the running back, same with the 3 defensive backs they took, and of course Velus Jones at wide receiver. And how about a punter with the last pick of the draft? I really actually was glad it played out that way. Like, even Ryan Poles kind of admitted at the end, like, they literally used their last draft pick on a punter because they didn't want to have to compete for him as an undrafted free agent. Like, I don't think he was going to take the punter like any earlier in this draft unless he felt like for some reason he absolutely had to, but they didn't want to have to get into a bidding war to try and get the punter in. Like, this was the punter they wanted. They wanted him as an undrafted free agent, but said, you know what, screw it. Let's get him here now to guarantee that, force him to come to us, as opposed to letting him go somewhere else, because there's no point to draft any punter any earlier than the end of the 7th round, because it's just, the success rate is not there. The punters that go undrafted end up being just as good as the punters that get drafted, and the only reason to draft a punter is this, so that you don't lose him in undrafted free agency. But you don't need to draft him any earlier than the 7th round, because anybody earlier than the 7th round is low chances that they're truly going to be that much better than any punter taken earlier in this draft. But overall, you come away with 2 guards, a center that are all going to be the depth guys, and maybe they end up kind of like the ones Ryan Pace took, like Lachavious Simmons, where they're backups and you try and develop them and you see what can happen, and maybe they can become something and maybe not, and that's what you expect out of 6th and 7th round picks. You get a pass-catching running back in there that gives you some flexibility if maybe you don't end up re-signing David Montgomery to a contract extension. Treston Ebner from Baylor is a perfect scheme fit, great receiver out of the backfield. And a lot of these guys are great special teams contributors too. The defensive backs are. Velus Jones is a kick returner. Treston Ebner is a kick returner as well. Dominic Robinson can do some special teams. Elijah Hicks, the safety from California, special teams. I mean, they're going to get value out of those players too, even if they're not on offense, right? They can be active on game day, getting special teams experience and be contributing to your roster that way as well. So I think that's why, again, in a vacuum, there's a lot to like about this draft class. I mean, there's so much of this like, well, they still don't have anything around Justin Fields. And that's totally true, 100%. But like, allow yourself to enjoy the draft class too, because like they added a bunch of players. There's a lot of players to like. There's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of talent. There's a lot. It's the draft. Like, it's a hopeful, optimistic time for adding football players to your team that you like and can like, even if they're not exactly what you want them to do. We'll have plenty of time to be concerned more about what Justin Fields' tools and weapons and protection are going to be. And those are very important concerns. But for now, let's actually enjoy the NFL draft and the excitement of the guys that this team did add. Certainly, we'll be breaking this draft class down for you all week long. We'll talk to some of our friends on the Locked On Podcast Network that cover these players in college. We'll talk to some of our draft friends in the draft community to come on and break down this Bears draft class. We'll hear from the general manager and head coach as well. So we got a lot to get to. I hope you'll keep tuning in 5 days a week here to the Locked On Bears podcast and hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. I hope tuning in to Locked On Bears helps you feel a little bit better about this draft class. Maybe, still some concerns surrounding this team, but most importantly, I hope the podcast makes it a little bit easier for you to bear down.